is not a regular English, my finger language. Normally, I use this so you can read. Okay, it's easier because I don't speak a regular language. So the aim of this paper is to show the evolution of attitude of the European institution concerning the problem of migrants, including the 50s, the 70s, the 60s, and the 70s. It's important to see this because we will note that the problems are the same now, and the solutions were different, and moreover, there are also some different migrants. So change also the figure of migrants, even if in the past we have a great differentiation. So, and at the same time, I use the case of Belgium, because I studied this, because it's an interesting example, because you can control the general institution and what happens in one country. And it's also important to remember that during the period I analyzed, the power of the European institution is less than now. So it was not possible to oblige European single government, national government, to apply immediately some rules. Okay, so it's different by now. And second, institution. It's evident that I analyzed 6 countries, but really are 5 because Italy is not a country receiving migrants in that period, but normally that export migrants. And the other particular thing is to note that there are very great difference between the 50s and the 70s because change the nature of migrants and also the country were native. So we have also to consider that in the first time you have few professional cases because we have only on European coal and steel, okay? And after, when with the common market, it is possible to have more migrants in Europe for other professionals, for Italian case, for the other countries, this not change. It really changed for German people because now we will see that it's more complicated than people think. Well, there are different migrants because there are a lot of cases. Because if you consider Italian people is in Europe in the 60s. So the rules concerning these people are different than the rules concerning other migrants. But when you consider migrants, you have also to consider that you have some people that is not French or Belgian or Dutch, but come from former colonies. So, for example, you have the same educational system. This evidently helps the integration. In other cases, you have to consider that if you consider West Germany, in the first period, in the 50s in particular, you have to consider that the migrants are also German people coming from the region, the former German region. So the region becoming Czechoslovakia or Poland. And in this case, there is some problem for the status because in many cases they start as refugees and after they become migrants. And other question, because you have also other countries that are in Western Europe because they belong to NATO. So in this case, you have different rules. Turkish people, Greece people, people coming from Portugal. It's interesting that I wrote here, if you know, that there's another case, Spain, where you have in Western but with dictatorship. Really, dictatorship exists also in Portugal. But Portugal is in the NATO. So in this case, the political government became less important. Because NATO is more important than the idea of dictatorship. So you have the particular case of the people coming from Spain, and also the case people coming from Germany. And the third case from Germany, remember, you have the people coming from former region, and moreover, people coming from East Germany. Because, and with some particular rules if you live in Berlin, but this is complicated, so it's not useful to explain now. Because if you are in Berlin, also in East Berlin, you are considered as West Germany if you migrate. This is mainly also the problem with the wall when you arrive. Okay, and where are the professional skills for these migrants? You have very different skills, and this means that you have very different problems or benefits, because the idea of this paper is study European and decided if migrants are a benefit, a occasion, a positive or negative, are a problem. Okay? It's evident that if you have not skilled workers, it's different the evaluation when you have skilled workers. And this is interesting because if you consider normally people coming from Western Europe, you have all the categories, no skilled and skilled profession. If you consider people coming from Eastern in the 15th and 60s, normally you have people with a high level of education, because normally these refugees are refugee migrants, are engineers, scientists that, for example, escaped from Hungary after 56, or in the following years from Poland or from Czechoslovakia after the Spring of Prague. Okay? So, and in our case, you have not skilled workers, and in this case, the majority in the first step coming from Italy, or in general for Mediterranean area. Okay? This change in the country, for example, Italian people are the the greatest group in Belgium. Portugal, people coming from Portugal are the most important minority for migrants in Luxembourg. Okay? And is important this presence? Yes, it's very important. Because one of the reasons of the golden age in Western Europe, in the sixth country, is also the presence of this workforce. This workforce, in particular, workers who allowed to great enterprises to develop without an immediate increase of salaries. Wages increased only in the 60s. During the 50s, the arrival of all this workforce allowed mines to factories to produce more without an important, a relevant increase of the cost of labor. Okay? And the case, the typical case is the Belgium. In Belgium, you have no the possibility to develop the coal mines and the factories without migrants. And also in Luxembourg. It's not possible. Without migrants, you have no the development of this country during the 50s. And also during the 60s for Luxembourg, for Belgium, less, because Belgium started its trajectory down in the 60s. And the problem are exactly the same, were exactly the same that you can find now. If you study the countries, it's the same. If you study France, if you study Luxembourg, the Netherlands, or West Germany, or Belgium, you have the same problem. And now I explain it, and after you can see a survey, two surveys that were prepared by European Economic Community. Okay? I explained this before, and after you can see the survey. Well, the problem are, in any case, avoid, for the state, it's important to avoid the over-exploitation of migrants. So, excessively low wages and overly priced accommodation. This is a problem also for native people, because when in a town arrive many migrants, a lot of migrants, you have an increasing of the price of housing. Okay? So we have some problem also for people living in these towns before the arrival of migrants. And the problem of ghettos. And here you have a different history. If you consider Paris, the outskirts, La Banlieue, you have different problems than in Luxembourg, Esch-sur-Alzette, or in Belgium, in Liège, Charleroi. And this is depend on the choice of public authority in this area. In any case, it's evident that that's a problem. because if you have the possibility to distribute better the workers, you have no problem with ghettos. If you did not have this possibility, you can create ghettos and you have more problem and more cost for migrants. And the other question very important is that European countries, the 5 European countries, have to prepare and to spend for this public spaces where migrants could meet their compatriots, but also to create structures where they could learn the language and customs of the country where they worked and lived. I remember that European Social Fund, starting 58, paid for vocational training for this, but only 50%. Okay? This means that the other half of the cost is for the countries. Okay? And I wrote, these policies implied a great cost for public institutions and the restriction of the number of migrants depending on the demand existing in the labor market. Okay? Because every time you have some migrants, you have benefits for enterprises, but for the public authorities you have more cost. Sorry? And when European institutions established that communities and factories will receive migrants and to create workers' villages, this arrived with the coals and steel community, including accommodation, school and leisure areas. It's evident that European institutions have to collaborate for the coast. Okay? And this is very important because if you consider the first years, as you have less migrants and only some sectors, this is possible because a lot of money in that is available for the European coal and steel community arrive from the taxation of the main factories in Europe. When you enlarge European economic community, you have more sectors, but you have more migrants. So you have some problem with the cost. It's okay. And so you understand why, if you consider the first community, you notice that, in particular, finances the building of new houses for migrants. Okay. When you study the common market arriving in 57, this is not possible. So the money that Europe spent is more for education, but not for housing or for something helping migrants in their new community. Okay? And there's a great problem for the new house for migrants. Every time you build a new house for migrants, you have problem with native people. Because you spend for new people and you don't spend for native people. Okay? And other problem is the health assistance, because the rule is that health assistance is regulated depending the treaty existing between the countries. But if you are in the case of Italy, Italy is in the community, so the health assistant is in charge of the host country. Okay? So this includes that you have some money that you spend for other people. In this case, as arrived now, you have a problem of native people that protest because I have to pay for my doctors. And others have to pay less, or sometimes they don't pay. Okay? This is the case of Belgium, for example. In Belgium, you have 4 insurers: Catholic, Socialist, Liberal, and Neutral. If you come in from another country and you are poor, you don't pay. And other people, in Flemish or Walloon people in 50s, protest because they have to pay for the doctors. Okay? A small quantity of money, but in any case, as our colleague in mathematics explained, few is more than 0. Okay? So, And the other problem in this is generally arrive every time. It's evident you have to pay to increase police. And note, not police because you think that foreign people stole. This is possible. But because generally you have an increasing of riots, of protest, of discussion between native and foreigners, but also between foreigners, between migrants, and moreover between communities of migrants. Particular case in Germany, people coming from Kurdistan and Turkish. It's okay? Or in Belgium, people coming from a region and another region. People coming from Calabria and Sicilia. It's okay? This typical clan that for. And now we see a survey because this discussion with benefits and cost started in the 50s, and you have two surveys with interview created, made by European institutions. You have to consider that these surveys have also another target. Not only to know, I want to know what happens with migrants in the 5 countries. Okay? But the idea was, when I know what happens, I decided if I have to finance or not. For example, I have the European Investment Bank. This bank finances only new infrastructure or the creation of new factories. Okay? The decision remains this, but the idea could be that this bank finances also the building of new house for migrants. This did not arrive. Okay? Well, and in particular, I have to underline, this survey is not mine, it's from a colleague of the University of Pisa, Elisa Tizzo. I insert this survey in my, I changed something, it's evident, but because the survey is public, but because the idea was to see how Europe created this survey, because the idea is how to evaluate the needs for migrants, and so the needs for we need to decide what I can spend for migrants as Europe. Okay? And so, European institutions and 12 European Economic Community member countries to solve the financial problem related to the research and integration of migrants. Well, this is a typical economic problem. If you are in the golden age, in the first part of the golden age, you have not so great problem to pay. Okay? When the economic conjuncture change, the economic trend change, you have some problem. The first country that has some problem is France. Why? Because France in '68 had a great problem and to change also the value of its currency. But before, you have the crisis in Belgium in the first year of the 60s, and in Germany in '66. Okay? So, when you have some internal crisis, you have the problem of migrants. Okay? This is a strict relation. And in this case, you are in the golden age. So, when I explain crisis, means that you don't have a growth of gross domestic product, not of 3% or 5%, but only 2%. So now it's a dream. But in the past was a crisis. So, Europe decided to understand in particular the problem of housing. Okay? Because housing means problem with native for creation of ghettos, problem with the cost of housing for all people living in that town. So it's important to analyze. Okay? And this survey, the first survey was carried out in France, Belgium, and West Germany. So the 3 more important. And It's very important because to study this, because if you don't create inadequate housing, you have some problem for all the town. And the example of Paris is evident in the 70s and after. So, and if you see these surveys, you discover that you have the same answer that you can have now. Okay? So, in Belgium, for example, you have some people that, on Germany, remarked that building national ghettos might hamper worker integration. But migrants had to establish better relations with native people and in particular improve their knowledge of language and local tradition. So the problem are migrants because they don't speak German, they don't use our habits, and they don't follow the tradition. It's okay? And it's very interesting that someone can think they are speaking about Italian people. Not only. They exactly speak also by people coming from East Germany or people coming from Prussia, from the region, the former German region that are in Poland now. So it's okay. So this is that because the problem is, in any case, that migrants is different. And you note the difference when you have some economic problem. Or when you have to spend for these people and you think what you can, in alternative, to receive with the same money. Okay? This is very interesting. I'm speaking about the early 60s, but I can speak with the same words of 2019. Okay? And here, I save you all the surveys, because in any case you have every time you have to repeat all things, but it's very interesting that after the first surveys you have a new commission recommendation. And in this commission recommendation it's wrote, a worker who is a national of a member state who is regularly employed in the territory of another member state shall enjoy the same rights and benefits as national workers in all matters relating to access to housing. I translate, if you're Italian, you have the same rights of other people, of other native people. Okay? And it established the abolition of all discrimination on the grounds of nationality, in particular with regard to the criteria for the allocation. So, if I ask for this house, I have the same rights that a native. Okay? Of rental housing, they granted by public authorities, or loans, you can receive loans as the other. Bonuses, if you have children, for example, subsidies, tax concern, etc. Okay? So, you have in 65 Europe, remember that all migrants, if you are in Europe or you coming from foreign colonies, you have the same rights of other people. Okay? I remember that now some parties won election criticizing this. Okay? And the second survey, I'm finished, is interesting because it was made after the oil shock. So, in economic trend, absolutely different. In this case, the problem is that before Europe financed, but when arrived the great crisis, it's very difficult to finance for migrants because during the 60s, the problem was that these people receive a job and is disposed to receive less money. Now the problem is that jobless is also for native people because you are during the great crisis. And so the problem became great. And I finished. In this case, Europe reaffirmed the same position, but in this case the problem is I have no money to finance this. So I consider that I tell countries you have to respect these rules, but they have no money to pay for you. So you can do as you want. Okay? And I finish with the conclusion, because in the surveys you receive the same problem of the first, but with the problem that you have no money to pay. And the conclusions are: European institutions' attention to the migrant flow from the 50s to the 70s allowed to underline all the social economic problems related to the arrival of people with different language, religion and habits in most of the European economic member countries. It's important in this case, remember that there's a small but not so small but relevant difference. You have not the problem of Islamic fundamentalism. Okay? You have Islamic migrants coming from former colonies from France. Okay? But not, they are not a problem for the religion. And in any case, during the Golden Age, the problems were clearly inferior to the benefits. So, we are sure in Belgium, in Luxembourg, in France, in the Netherlands, in West Germany, the benefits for the arrival of migrants were superior to the coast. Okay? In particular, Belgium and Luxembourg, and the northern of France, in the Moselle region. The ability of migrants, in fact, represented one of the most relevant factors in favor of the excellent results of the European common market. Only in the 70s, when the oil shock, and the later negative economic trend strongly reduced the job in Western Europe, the problem of migrants and their accommodation became important in favor of measures limiting the immigration in Europe. This problem means that the status of migrants, rather the source of social problem, in particular depended on the economic trend and only for a small part of the cultural differences. And I finish with the example of Luxembourg, because in Luxembourg you have some migrants, and Luxembourg has chosen its migrants. So, for industry, Italian people, for agriculture and services, people coming from Portugal. It's evident that if you can have a choice, okay, you have an economic positive trend, it's easy to have migrants. In the other condition, you have more problem. The solution is to pay. In any case, I finish.
Thank you very much for our four spoken men and women, and for these three very interesting works and three different cases and arguments. And now we have our discussant Alessandro Bozzetti that have a very difficult work. Thank you.
So thanks. Well, if the keywords of the early afternoon were immigration and citizenship rights, the keywords of the second part of the afternoon can be immigration and highly skilled migrants. An immigration experienced by a generation of European natives who had the chance to move to Europe without the need for a passport, for example, to visit certain countries that often have the same currency, enjoy a range of rights coming from their European citizenship. And this new form of migration seems to follow the patterns of the intra-regional ones at the national level. For this reason, also from a semantic point of view, the intra-EU flows are increasingly defined as mobility rather than migration. And other factors come into play. For example, the greater easiness in the movement, which can lead to a real transnational commuting, new forms of global neighborhood allowed by the new media and also social networks, and the greater familiarity with foreign languages, for example, the possibility to have study experiences abroad. Thanks, Christina, for the presentation. We mainly focus on the concept of brain drain and also brain gain, on its contextualization from a medical point of view, highlighting also benefits and disadvantages for countries of origin and countries of destination. If the brain drain, in my opinion, was accompanied by a concomitant brain circulation, the situation would not be so complicated. The key point is not only that there would be a gradual increase in the level of qualification of human capital within the country, but at the same time it's unclear the inability of several countries, for example to the Italian one, to attract qualified human capital from the rest of the world. In your paper you also write that the less attractive regions for highly educated movers appear to be mostly located in Italy. Moreover, thanks because I was not aware of the European professional card, so the term certificate that the professional has met all the necessary conditions to provide services in most member states. And the second part of your presentation, you presented the result of the survey conducted in 2018 in Romania and focused on low rates. The main causes for migration, the reason behind the choice of a specific country, the idea of a permanent migration, and the expectation with regards to the labor market sector in which to be employed. One of the main findings of this case study, in my opinion, is related to the fact that the main causes for which Romanian law students would choose to immigrate are the health system precariousness, followed by high corruption level, the presence of poorly paid jobs, and the precarious education system. And these findings remind me of a research conducted by Space in 2012, focused on the most unacceptable problems in Italy for those who have decided to migrate. The absence of meritocracy seems to be the most intolerable fault of Italy, reported by more than half of the respondents, followed by other issues such as favoritism and the low quality of the middle class, the cultural decay of the people, already in 2012, the poor quality of services, so some aspects seem to overlap to your findings. And also regarding the possibility of returning, the Italian respondents in a survey conducted by Alessandro in 2014 seem to be more skeptical than the Romanians. When respondents were asked to express an opinion on the hypothesis of a return to Italy, 42% said it would be very unlikely, at least over the next 5 years. And another very interesting finding is that only 4.5% of the sample say they would accept work in the secondary sector. Unqualified jobs, characterized by difficult working conditions and poor opportunities for upward mobility. And therefore, calling into question the concept of brain waste, it identified the process of de-skilling that occurs when highly skilled workers migrate for employment forms that do not require the implementation of previously acquired skills. Other research referred to one focus on young Italians show that not always highly skilled leave the country in search of a job corresponding to their qualification. On the contrary, it would be an increasing number of youth who, in order to immigrate, are able to perform low skill and not integrated to their level of education jobs. Australia, a country which in recent years has exponentially increased the number of immigrants from Italy, especially among the under-30s, is a significant example. Demands for a special type of visa, the working holiday visa, related to seasonal jobs, such as in the agricultural field or in construction, increased very significantly. And away from they are therefore willing to accept a kind of job that otherwise would not be accepted. This is apparently contradictory. I think attitude should be, however, understood also in relation with the importance for young people to have an experience abroad and to possibly increase also their language skills. And these dynamics are truly multi-faced and interesting, I think, to investigate. I would have only one curiosity. Are you aware of any research on these issues conducted before the entry of Romania in the European Union, in order to understand if these aspects have changed during the time? Moving to the presentation of Pedro and Jose Carlos, it was very interesting to read your draft, in which you started out by emphasizing the existence of boundaries, not physical among countries' boundaries, but among social scientists. And the highly skilled migrants, you say, are US so specific that their study must not be mixed with other, referring to a distinct condition and theoretical need to specific form of mobility. Make a comparison between highly and less skilled migrants, collecting evidence about social demographic profile, migration strategies, and integration processes was very useful for possible convergences and obviously divergences. You pointed out that the study of highly skilled migrants has been relatively scarce if compared with research on economic migrants, and this is due to the fact that for a long time the international migration were characterized by the movement of the poorest class of society, and the migration as phenomenal intellectual mobility have a relatively recent history, and this is particularly true for those migration who involve highly skilled migrants. Also, from a linguistic point of view, you highlight an interesting aspect. I referred earlier to the difference between migration and mobility. But you correctly point out that highly skilled migrants do not view themselves as migrants, but as expatriates, and giving this designation to poorer labor migrants. I mentioned only a few findings. As already mentioned above, free movement within the European Union, geographical proximity, transport and communication facilities, migratory networks based on already existing flow provide the main factors explaining the preponderance of European destination. These flows are, in my opinion, often multi-directional, but at the same time they allow to detect sometimes predetermined flows towards some destination characterized by specific aspects. So urban context, for example, like romantic context, with available friendship or parental networks. In any case, it appears, at least in the EU, geographical mobility, structure, and extremely flexible. FEVL defines Eurostars, those young European cosmopolitans that fully exploit the benefits of living in Europe without borders, but however do not come to a full European identification. At the same time, they are also youth who try to develop a professional career in line with their aspiration in their own country and are induced to emigrate. The overlap between the Erasmus generation and the precarious generation seems to be a characteristic of the youth mobility. So maybe related to Europa only. Coffee break e no? Ma forse perché and also, as I already mentioned, also economic motivation constitutes strong migratory reasons in both groups, highly invested in migrants, but in the more skilled, this gets supplanted by the relevance attributed to the realization of new experiences. And we can therefore ask ourselves if the reason behind the decision to migrate are mainly economic reasons, so structural factors, or maybe we can speak about, at least in some cases, of cultural reasons, expressed in terms of willingness to try new life experiences elsewhere. And the boundaries are exceeding not just looking for work, but also, for example, for reason or reason related to lifestyle. The so-called hydraulics models to interpret the migration based on push and pull factors are increasingly unsatisfactory, and the trajectories of mobility linked to economic factors seem to be still predominant, but new explanatory schemes based on the surplus of the subjective reason than the others objective ones are spreading. And I also briefly refer to the relationship with the country of origin, analyzed in the paper, not in your presentation, very quickly, according to the transnationalism perspective, in terms of sending remittances, on visits, media usage to communicate, and participation also in the political sphere and the future plan of the respondent. I briefly mentioned the transnationalism perspective only to emphasize that today, according to certain literature, the multiple reference points that youth have and the experience living in the context of increasing globalization lead to a different interpretive framework, passing from a transnational type to a more cosmopolitan one. And less emphasis on national backgrounds and a focus on the general context in which young people live, characterized by complex connectivity, job insecurity, but also greater years of travel. Contemporary globalization processes will be characterized on one end by a growing interconnection, capable of creating public sphere, capable of defining personal experience on a planetary dimension, and on the other end, a widespread condition of uncertainty, precariousness and risk, which, by eliminating those fixed points on which to balance one's own experience, would make the space within which to imagine himself more and more agonistic. And this condition would translate into a flexibility that pushes young people, many young people, to think about their future differently in the destination country, in the country of origin, or elsewhere, thinking of life projects that increasingly look at global horizon. And I believe that investigating also this aspect too can be of great help to understand the future plans of respondents. And finally, moving to the last presentation, the theme returns to be a little wider, that calling to question the European institution and the evolution of their attitudes concerning migration from the 50s to the 70s, with a specific focus on the Belgian migrant policies, very useful also to show some instances. You cite in your paper emblematic surveys, useful to highlight the problems and approaches using different decades. And the thing that surprised me most of all is the sentence, the survey led to the adoption of the Commission recommendation of the housing of workers. Single research, a survey having practical implication is increasingly a rarity today, I think. In fact, we were in 1965. Evidently, the European institution wanted to know in depth this dynamic, but perhaps the problem was more of an economic nature due to the lack of money to help these countries. Moreover, both the surveys, but also the in-depth study in the Belgian case, have housing as one of the central themes. As mentioned at the beginning of the afternoon, the job and housing issues, and consequently the rights referred to them are closely related. It's a sort of vicious circle that makes the experience of isolation of migrants totalizing. During the 70s, during the oil crisis, a restriction of work permission for migrants coming from Asia and Africa obliged them to work in illegal activities, so they were perceived as a social problem in direct competition with low-skilled Belgian workers. And this poor work caused a marked increase in discrimination, xenophobia, and intensified labor market competition. So it seems familiar. And in your analysis, but also in the email exchange we had, you highlighted that the problems related to the management of migratory flows were not so different 40, 50, 60 years ago if compared to those existing now. A very emblematic example is that relative to the problem that new houses for migrants were not appreciated by native families without lodgement. And this created tension and discussion in the municipalities where migrants had their accommodation. And this similarity with what is happening today is evident particularly towards Roma and Sinti. As highlighted by Manconi today, according to the European Commission, the Roma minority is the most discriminated. We are talking about a minority that today in Italy is estimated at around 180,000 people. 50% are Italian citizens, 60% are residents of stable houses. A minority that risks to be the scapegoat for collective anxieties and social frustration. But at the time, as you pointed out, according to the first survey, Italian workers had great difficulties in assimilating to the general way of life. And to conclude beyond housing problems, other forms of socio-economic exclusion reinforces the sense of alienation and isolation, split apart, social and cultural marginalization. I repeat, very similar issues to those that exist today. And you say that both the survey displayed that European attitudes toward the housing problems of migrant workers were mainly affected by national migration policies. At the same time, the status of migrants as a relevant resource or rated as social problem depend above all on the economic trend. Well, do you think that is just a matter of money, or perhaps the approach during all these years has been wrong? So, thanks.
Thank you very much. And Cristina, Pedro, Jose, Paolo, would you like to?
Yes, thank you, Alessandro.
And after, there are some any questions?
Okay,
Please.
so if I understood correctly, you wanted to know if I know about researches in the brain drain area made in Romania before the European Union integration, yes? Okay. So there are some research, but not just only on brain drain migration. There are research made on all migration. Because in Romania, it was different, the brain drain migration period from the migration of low-skilled people. So there are some steps of migration. Till 2007, the year when Romania migrated, the migration from Romania to other countries, especially to Italy, because here came a lot of Romanian migrants, was characterized by low-skilled migration, because people came here or in Spain or even in Germany or the United Kingdom to work in secondary sector, like agriculture, maybe construction, and so on. But after 2007, it is the latest trend for migration from Romania to other European countries, because the European integration facilitated the migration of highly skilled migrants to other European countries. So it was a trend for them. So this is the latest trend in migration. And yes, from 2007 to this day, were made a lot of researches, but now not so many researches before, and not strictly on this, because they were there, the highly skilled migrants, but not in so high number. And in Romania, it's a very big problem because a lot of persons working in medical sector went to other countries. So we have very big problems in medical sector. That is why in our research was that result. The problems in medical sector, because we have these kind of problems. There are regions in Romania where it's no doctor at all. So it's like one doctor to 1,000 people and in large areas, hundreds of kilometers. So it's very difficult. And even the doctors and nurses also, we have very large problems.
I was mentioning the cultural factors that we mentioned as an important part in deciding to meet a more qualified role. We can see that these cultural factors could be present in the answer. I migrate to get new experiences that point somewhere to some post-materialistic values, as it's contributed, values that are not attached to capitalistic values. But when we ask them other questions, if they were satisfied with employment and so on, we see that the position they have in the labor market in Portugal and the position they get when they arrive in this destination country was still a relevant factor. So in fact they say a lot of times that they migrate you to experience new things, but then we get a little bit deeper and then see that the materialistic values are still very important for the migration. There is an important difference between these two groups, the low qualified and the highly qualified. Because both of them migrate because of labor shortages or labor problems or difficulties to have a career in Portugal. But qualified migrants use more the human capital to get integrated in the society, while lesser qualified migrants use more the social capital. They have the networks that they have already in that country, France and the UK and the Netherlands. So these are two important differences that we explore in another text, but that are very clear when we ask which factor helps them in integrating in the house.
I started to add explain two things that are important. Well, benefits. When you consider the benefits, you have also to consider all money that people send home. And in this case, when this money arrives in Italy, you increase the money in Europe. And it's important because if you read the book, not important book of Francesca Paolo, about the European integration history, you know that before the crisis, one goods on free was traded between the six in Europe. All the goods in Europe, 1 or 3 on 3, arrived to be traded in the six. So this means that you increase a lot the earnings for Europe, because you give more, you give a job, but you have more possibility to sell goods. It's okay, and the same. You have also to think another thing. When you analyze Europe in the 50s, you have to consider that Europe is not only the Europe; it's also a part of Africa. It's okay, because